with me. We're also joined by Dr. Donal and Jill Kerby, because next Sunday marks the 5th anniversary since the infamous bank guarantee in September 2008. Huge implications of that night. So we wanted to have a discussion about the legacy of that night in September. Was the bank guarantee our only option? Donal, of course, is the former Deputy Director of the IMF. He's now a member of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council that the current government set up but seem to routinely ignore. But I might ask Donal about that in a moment. Jill Kerby, of course, is personal finance columnist with the Sunday Times. Donal, if I could start with you first. A lot of criticism of that decision that night, and it's, I suppose, a narrative has developed that all of our problems almost stem from that night in September. Is that correct, or is that too simplistic in your view?
In my view, it is not correct, and it is too simplistic. The big mistake was what happened before the guarantee, everything that got us into this mess. In my view, the guarantee was the least worst alternative of all of those that were there. The recent book I wrote with Anton Murphy, and we examined all possible alternatives to the guarantee, such as doing nothing, waiting a few days, getting the Central Bank of Ireland to lend money, nationalising Anglo, guaranteeing only deposits and so on.
Letting the banks go.
Letting the banks go, indeed. And when you look at all of those, I think you would, at least we conclude, that none of them would have succeeded in preventing a collapse in confidence in the Irish banking system immediately in the days after.
By the way, I presume you acknowledge that the guarantee was too wide. There's some kind of guarantee.
I think some kind of comprehensive guarantee was essential. I think the only part of it that I think there was legitimate discussion about is the subordinate bank debt, which was included in the guarantee. But even there, it turned out that most of that sub-debt didn't fall due until after September 2010. And in fact, although it was covered by the guarantee, in fact, the government was able to burn about 80% of the junior bond holders.
So what kind of cost are you talking about from the subordinate?
I think for the sub-debt probably ended up costing us in the region of 3 or 4 billion, but not a huge amount, more than that. And of course 3 or 4 billion is quite a bit. But the rest of the guarantee, I think unfortunately there wasn't a better alternative. And when you look at all the possibilities, go through them as we do analytically, you would have ended up not preventing a collapse in confidence in the banking system and indeed the banking system itself, or you would have ended up with the same cost down the road.
Okay, Jill Kerby, do you agree or disagree?
I agree that the problem started long before September 2008. I mean, it started back probably in 1999, around then, when house prices started going crazy, really. I mean, they started then well into throughout the noughties, and it was mainly because interest rates were set too low. I mean, we no longer had control over interest rates after, and we just decided to enjoy the proceeds of the perfect storm, which was that there were a lot of people working again. Things had improved, absolutely, but interest rates became too low. The government encouraged too much house ownership through its tax breaks and things. I mean, we know what all this combination of things happened to just let rip the greatest property bubble of all time. By 2008, clearly it was over, and that bank guarantee resulted in, I think, the collapse of faith and confidence in the Irish banks anyway. 5 years along, we have no faith and confidence in them. Certainly not individuals, because they don't lend to us anymore. They're calling in all their bad debts. They're not writing off any of the debt that they colluded with us to borrow, and which the government encouraged as well. And, it was really interesting. Knowing I was coming on here, I went back to some of the archive, and the ECB itself made a very interesting comment on the day after, a couple of days after, which was October 3rd, 2008. They did a note on the Irish bank guarantee, and if I can just very quickly quote, it says, while the ECB appreciates that any guarantees provided by the Minister under this law are contingent, given that the financial exposure of the Irish state under such guarantees is potentially very large, the government could be obliged to make significant payments in the cases of these guarantees if they're called in at a point in time where the Irish budgetary position is deteriorating. That was long before we realised how serious it was, and may risk exceeding the 3% GDP reference value for public deficit. This is a cause for concern, even when the provision of financial support is possible. Ultimately, what they were saying just a few days later was, "Have you any idea what the consequences of this is? You're going to go broke."
That's laughable, because even if we hadn't guaranteed the banks, they would have made sure we repaid every bondholder. So I mean, that's called having your cake and eating it, isn't it?
Well, okay, but I mean, it wasn't as if, again, in 2007, the IMF came out with a very, very strong position saying, "You're in big trouble here. The amount of borrowing that is being done, the debt-to-loan level of all of your banks is an average of 150%. You're borrowing huge amounts of this money on the interbank."
We're agreed the building was on fire, if to use that metaphor, by September 2008.
Shane, my view is that, and it is what I mean, I'm not an expert in finance and banking, but I am about money and personal finance, okay? And that is that when you're bust, the best thing you can do is just declare your bankruptcy, negotiate with your creditors, do the best you can, accept the consequences of that, which are inclibly serious.
I'm sorry, are you saying...
they should have let the banks go. They should have. The private banks should have been allowed to go. Listen, I'm just giving you my opinion.
Well, let's tease it out.
In North America, I'm Canadian, but in the States especially, when a bank goes bust, it goes bust. Depositors over the deposit limit are burned. We had already increased by, I think it was the middle of September, the deposit guarantee had gone up from 20,000 to 100,000. At that stage, I was writing and saying to my readers, "This is really serious, folks. Get your money out." I mean, when they have to do that, that means the banks are in deep trouble when you have to increase a bank guarantee. That's bad news. But they had to do that to stop people from lining up outside AIB. But that was the trigger, I think, or that was the warning for ordinary people. Get your money out of the Irish bank.
We're going to tease this out a little bit more in a moment. John, what do you think? The idea of, say, for example, letting Anglo-Irish Bank go. A lot of people say we should have done it, but do they fully understand the consequences of that?
This is an odd quirk about the whole, whatever you call it, pseudoscience of money and economics, that it's seemingly that when you're right up close to it, it's very hard to actually understand what's happening. Very often, you can have a retrospective view and a settled analysis of it, but right through the boom, we were so close to it that it seemed there was a certain psychology that developed that prevented people actually being able to speak about the dangers. It's almost like that inarticulateness is built into the nature of boom and prosperity in the first place. And similarly, we have this at this moment. Now, I think the allocation of blame is not a particularly useful exercise in the context of what was the September 2008, because that syndrome was very much like we don't know what's going to happen. It's almost unpredictable. We can tell what happened previously, but the dynamics of these crises are so unpredictable that I would have deep sympathy for the set of politicians who were involved in trying to make a decision then. And you have to remember as well that in the weeks afterwards, for like a couple of weeks afterwards, the kind of commentary that followed on this treated it as a kind of a triumph, a kind of a cunning plan that had been, that the Irish had really pulled a fast one in terms of this guarantee, and that we would get out from under this guarantee.
Alistair Darling was unhappy, and the Chancellor of the UK Exchequer was unhappy, and we'd pulled a fast one. Yeah. We'd got out of the way. And
that's again that syndrome. So now I can't say. I don't know what you could say that given the information that was available at that time, the conditions that appear to be there, what other decision could have been made?
Okay,
because people didn't know. They didn't know how serious the Anglo problem was.
Donal, imagine if that night, if Brian Cowan had said, we're not propping up Anglo. As Jill says, this is a capitalist society we live in. They have sailed too close to the sun, and they're going to have to get burned, and everybody involved is going to get burned. What would the impact of that be?
I think the question is not really Anglo per se. Nobody wants to save Anglo or its shareholders, but we have to think of the financial reputation of the country. Now, if Anglo had been defaulted on the following day, first of all, the headlines in the world would have been Irish banking system defaults, the first default since the Eurozone began, and indeed in the 5 years since then, there has been no bank has defaulted except in the case of Cyprus, and Cyprus is not a very good example that we want to follow. But what would have happened? The headlines all over the world, Irish banking system on verge of collapse, major bank, shut down. What would have happened is that immediately people would have run, rightly so, who had accounts in AIB and BOI, and they would have besieged the doors because they would have known, and indeed it would turn out to be the case, that AIB and BOI, and especially AIB, were just in as bad shape as Anglo. You see, one of the myths mistakes about this is that people think that Anglo was the only bad apple in the cart. It wasn't. It turned out that AIB, which is 99.9% state ownership, was just as bad.
So you're saying we would have had a scene like out of It's a Wonderful Life. Basically, people would have been banging down the doors of the bank to get their money.
I have seen this in some other countries, Argentina and Indonesia, and it's not pretty. It's not that people line up docilely in the street and say, well, we'll wait for a few hours and see if we can get our money out. No, that's not what happens. There were riots, there's violence, there's huge tension, and above all, let me just come back to this point. Ireland's reputation as a very open, financially, liberal economy, I think would have been quite fatally compromised.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
you're guessing at that. The same way I'm guessing that maybe the outcome would have been different, that maybe the ECB would have had to step in at some point and make some kind of arrangement so that this great crisis would have been stemmed a little bit. I know they did.
They did with the Anglo promissory note, and we ended up having to pay half of the 64 billion as the Anglo promissory note, which is exactly what happened in the months and year afterwards.
But maybe there would have been a different turnout. Maybe there would have been a situation where depositors wouldn't have been completely burned. Anybody over 100 grand, well, that's tough. They were told, they were warned.
A lot of businesses had money on deposit.
Well,
institutions, pension funds, insurance funds, credit unions.
What we did was an incredibly dishonest solution, which is going to dog us for 20, 30 years maybe. I'm convinced of this. We have so much debt now, and I know people, perhaps yourself, Donal, certainly bankers seem to think, and politicians, that debt doesn't matter because there will be recovery, because it can be stretched out as we have done.
Isn't there another elephant in the room here, and that's the ECB? Would they have allowed us?
I don't know, but what I'm saying is
we do know.
We
actually do know.
Not necessarily. How can you say that?
Well, because we know when the new government came in and they tried to burn bondholders, and the ECB, we know for a fact that the ECB...
post the guarantee. Sorry, that was post guarantee.
It was nothing to do with the guarantee.
All I'm saying, let me finish this point, please. What I'm saying is that the debt problem, let's move on here a little bit, folks. We can go on about this. These decisions were made. They were wrong, I think. But we have a catastrophic debt problem in this country. We went from a government debt of 47 billion in 2007. It's 207 billion now.
Yeah, we know. We
have private debt.
The question we want to ask
the question we want to ask
today is, could we have avoided that?
I'm not saying we could.
This is the question.
I'm not saying we could have avoided that. I think we could have gone bankrupt as a state, a modern state with a modern
solution.
Argentina. Not Argentina. Argentina was a basket case. Argentina had the worst corrupt government. Argentina, even after it kept going bust. Hang on. After it went bust a multiple of times, they let them borrow again, and they let them inflate their currency again and make all the same mistakes. I don't think that would have happened here. And I also think this nonsense that there would have been no banks open, that there would have been no ATMs. There were functioning banks in this country, not Irish ones. There were other countries with functioning banks that would have come in.
But hang on. 99% of people had their money in Irish banks, not in foreign banks.
When you go bust, which we did, and now individuals are going bust, and I mean bankrupt bust, you have to own up to the consequences, and you have to work your way out of that, and that is the clean and honest way to do it.
It is the clean, honest way, but do you accept,
and it means you get over
the people listening here today who are seduced by the idea of a bank being let go bust, they have to also face up to the fact they would have lost their money in that bank.
Let me just put sorry, and I'm so sorry to take up so much time here, but I get annoyed at this. There are still people, I hear from them all the time, readers, I meet them, who still have more than 100,000 euros in Irish banks because they think everything's wonderful. It's not. They are at risk of losing their money now, even 5 years later.
Okay, John Watts.
I broadly agree with what Jill's saying there, because, I think there are two questions. The question earlier was about the night of the guarantee, and I was talking about the conditions that prevail at that time. There's a different question, which is a broader moral question going forward, as it were, about this debt. And I think that's a different question in a way. It's not, and that's where I would indict politicians, is their failure, Irish politicians, and their failure to spell out the context in which this has occurred. Dealing with the problem at the time was one question. Changing the conditions out of which this crisis erupted is a different question, and they have done nothing whatever to deal with that. The reality of it is that we have a money system which generates debt as an inevitable byproduct of its own structure. It's not possible to actually have, on the present kind of other than debt growing. What is the solution to debt? What is the solution to debt, to the debt problem? It's more debt. That's the only solution which the system offers us. Now, the only way of creating money, more or less, in this economy is to generate debt. and that's going to be a problem down the road. The very best we can do with this is put a band-aid on it. And nobody's talking.
The difficulty is if you get rid of debt, we would have been left with a budget deficit of 20 billion
but this
euros.
is a structural problem.
And we would have had to address that budget deficit.
But that's to keep it in the same logic of the moment. I'm talking about the moral imperative.
But John, isn't it important? Isn't it important to spell out? And I think Jill, to be fair, is doing this. She's putting a thesis, but it's important to spell out the consequences of that thesis. And when people say let the banks go, get rid of debt, that also means adjusting the budget by 20 billion.
Let me put it in a different way.
And that causes a lot of pain.
There is the fact that the money system, which should rightly belong to the people for use to exchange their talents and labours and goods and resources, is no longer available for this predominantly. It is in the hands of an elite bunch of speculators, bankers, who are actually not part of the real economy have destroyed. Now, one day soon, this will have to be dealt with, and that's why I say Michael Noonan, Enda Kenny should be saying these things. Whether there's any day-to-day implications immediately for the Irish economy or any changes that would result from that is a different question, but they certainly should be spelling this out. Somebody needs to be spelling out this problem, and it isn't happening anywhere else.
I think the question of moral aspect of debt is important, but fundamentally issues of debt are dealt with in a pragmatic way by debtors and creditors as to what the system can bear. Now, one way would have been to, and it is an option, to basically default it on the debt or allow the banks to default, and that would have had, in my view, and I agree with Jill, it's a speculative matter, but I think if you were the Taoiseach on the night of the 28th, you were faced with immediately the following morning pragmatic consequences, and you had to take.
You were panicked into that pragmatic decision.
Yes, they were in a horrible hole, which was, we all know that, and that's the past. But what in fact happened is that the Europeans, and indeed this view was shared by the Irish authorities, was that we're not going to default because in our view the costs to Ireland and the euro, and then the euro, we're part of the euro and so on, were too high. What in fact has happened is that the Europeans and the Troika have lent us the money, for example via the promissory note and stretching it out and so on, and via the bailout, in order to be able to continue to pay the bondholders. You're right, John, that involves them carrying more debt, but it is debt that is much more stretched out than the original debt.
A lot of texts, and they always come in when we talk about this. Of course. How did Iceland get away with a default and we did?
Iceland was not in the EU. Iceland was able to devalue. Iceland suffered a great deal. Iceland's recession was very, very severe. It was arguably more severe even than Ireland. But if we were outside the euro, probably we wouldn't have got into this mess in the first place, because we would have really controlled our banking system. The reason, and Jill's right, we didn't control our banking system is we thought that the Europeans would look after us, and we got into trouble. And they did in a certain way by lending us money to keep the show on the road. But in effect what's happened is that they have lent us the money to be able to continue without a default. Maybe a default would have been better, but the costs would have been very high for Europe and for Ireland. And remember again, in the 5 years since the banking guarantee, no European bank, with the exception of Cyprus, has actually defaulted. Whether that's a good
Jill Kerby,
or not, I don't know.
If you were Brian Cowan that night, it would have been an incredibly difficult decision to make. To say, okay, we're going to let Anglo go. Now, Taoiseach, if you do that, there will probably be people banging down the doors of every branch of Bank of Ireland and AIB in the morning. That would be an incredible gamble for any Taoiseach to have.
For any politician. And, Shane, you're absolutely right about that. That's why they're not actually facing the built-up problem now. They just haven't done it. Nobody wants to deliver bad news to the electorate, and especially a Taoiseach who didn't have a clue what was going on anyway. That government let the bubble be built up, and he admitted he didn't see it coming, didn't know how to handle it. We were so badly served by regulation, by politics. No, I'm not saying that.
Table agrees 1,000% with what you're saying.
But what I'm saying now is that 5 years along, it's still extend and pretend. We now have finally. We were talking about this a little bit outside. 5 years later, finally they're getting around to looking at the consequence to ordinary people, to the taxpayers who are actually bailing everybody out, bailing out the banks, bailing out the capitalist system, having all that debt socialized to them. And what are the consequences of that? Well, no banks are lending. People are going bust. They are finally, and it's finally being recognized that ordinary folk are going bust, insolvent and bankrupt. and they're leaving. And the young, productive workers that we need to support this huge spending platform of payments to half the population or on some kind of a social welfare benefit, for God's sake. I mean, that's continuing 5 years later. All of this means that we're going to keep losing the brightest, the best, who really should get out if they want to have any future, because all that they have in the future is the payment of the debts that our generation built up.
That's a very bleak perspective of the future.
Damned right it is.
Okay, John Waters, just very briefly, if you would, we're almost out of time.
I think this is important. I mean, these are not just moral questions. They're actually technocratic questions. I mean, the quality of hope that is present in an economy at any given moment is an intensely technocratic issue. And that's what actually is happening now, is the hope is being sucked out of our economy, or our psychology. Like we had one kind of psychology which created the problem. We have the opposite kind of psychology now, which is this kind of incipient despair, which people see a long stretch, a whole life of going to old age, of hopelessness. They'll never be able to do any more than struggle. They're exporting their children.
If they're lucky, they'll be able to keep a home that they will never be able to pay off, not even in their retirement.
That's very bad economically. That's bad economically. Never mind morally.
We need massive debt forgiveness for ordinary people.
Last word. All of these things you've said are very true, but I think the question you asked, Shane, and it is often avoided by people who say, the guarantee was what done us in. They do not consider, analytically, coldly, go through all of the list of alternatives to see whether they would have been a less worse.
Is the future as bleak as
I think countries actually do.
I think that's the wrong question.
I would not be as pessimistic in the sense that countries do and individuals do work through debt problems. It's going to take a long time given the huge cost of the Irish debt. And I'm certainly not excluding the idea that there'll be write-offs either internally, domestically, or by the EU of part of our debt down the road. That's probably part of the solution.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Fascinating discussion. Dr. Donal Donovan, former Deputy Director of the IMF and a member of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, and Jim Kerby, former personal columnist. Current personal finance columnist with the Sunday Times. Sorry about that, Joe.
That's not the case after this radio.
John Waters, thanks for your company over the last hour and a half. We'll be back with sport